me. I can't help it. But life is full of disappointments, not just for Tennessee fans. Y'all expected Josh Brown this morning, so you got disappointed too. You've got me, but I appreciate you sticking around. We're a little sparse, I guess, with the folks that have maybe gone to camp and stuff, but I appreciate you all sticking around for Bible class. Mike is ready back there to get a count of daily Bible readers, so if you'll raise your hand if you are a daily Bible reader. And does anybody need a book? Scott's got some books. If you need one, raise your hand. He'll get you one. We're on lesson 7 in the book, Jesus the Good Shepherd. Before we begin our class, W.A., would you mind leading us in a word of prayer, sir? Thank you, W.A. As I said, we're on lesson 7, the Good Shepherd. And in our book, the author of the study guide started talking about English terms that I remembered from way back in school. He talked about metaphors and similes, and I had to confer with my English teacher wife about what the difference in those terms was. And she has to teach this morning, so she's not up here to correct me, which she would enjoy doing if I was wrong. But she said a metaphor is a comparison of two things without using the words like or as. It's saying something is, whereas a simile would be if you use the words like or as. So a simile would be like when Paul said in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. That's a simile. He's comparing the coming of the Lord as a thief in the night, whereas a metaphor doesn't use like or as. It would be like in Isaiah 64 where it says, we are the clay and you are the potter. Okay, of course, we're not actually clay, but in the sense of we allow God to mold us into what He wants us to become, we are clay. And so the author pointed that out, and I'm glad my salvation doesn't depend on knowing that and remembering the difference, but I thought it was interesting because there's a lot of metaphors and similes in the Bible. And you think just about the ones, if you just look at the ones involving Jesus, there's a tremendous amount. He's described the light of the world, the bread of life, the vine, and many metaphors about Jesus. And in the lesson we're going to look at this morning, he is described as the Good Shepherd. And sheep and shepherds are very prominent in the Bible, and I don't think I'd ever really thought about how prominent they are until I started looking at this lesson. You can go back and look at some of at that occupation all the way back to Abel. Abel was a shepherd. Moses was a shepherd. Abraham was a shepherd. David was a shepherd. Many of the prominent Old Testament characters were shepherds. Barry talked about Job this morning. Job, at the beginning of that book, had 7,000 sheep, which I can't imagine having 7,000 of any kind of animal, much less sheep. I don't know how you could stand it, because two of the things, bleeding, get on my nerves, and you hear that bleeding of the sheep, that baa, in your sleep. If you're around more than one sheep at all, and then to have 7,000, I don't know how you would not go crazy. But then at the end of the book, when God restores all Job's possessions and his family and things, he doubled that amount. And so he had 14,000 at the end of the book. And I just don't see how that's doing Job any favors, but he evidently counted it a blessing to have that many sheep. So, but it kind of goes to show you just how important and how prominent sheep were in Bible times. Of course, they provided food for people. They provided clothing through their wool, and so they were very prominent. And you look at many of the Old Testament writings in the book of Psalms. David talked about sheep a lot. One example was Psalm 100, verse 3. Know that the Lord, He is God. It is He who has made us and not we ourselves. We are His people and the sheep of His pasture. And we could look at many, many verses in the book of Psalms where David talked about sheep and compared Israel to sheep who had gone astray, sheep who had been scattered. And if you've ever been around sheep, you know you would know what that looks like, because if you're not the shepherd and you go running into a sheep pen or a pasture full of sheep, they go every which direction, and they scatter. And so when he says Israel scattered like sheep, you kind of understand what that might look like. Jesus in Mark chapter 6 and verse 34, remember, before he fed the 5,000s, it said, Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. And that imagery is they didn't know which direction to go. They were just kind of scattered and didn't have a shepherd to guide them in the right way. Sheep are sort of curious creatures, and they have a way of getting into trouble. And so in my mind, they're not that intelligent either. But so I guess there's a good comparison between them and us, because they have a way of getting into trouble and not always doing what you would think, hey, logically, they need to do. They'll go out and get stuck in a hole, or they'll get trapped in some kind of fence, or go in an area where you know there's danger, but they're sheep. They're not necessarily that smart, and they don't sense that danger. And so a shepherd is very important, and would have been very, very important in Old Testament times. And because we don't see that, and sometimes we do things not all that smart, right? You go all the way back to Eve, and Adam and Eve, and all they had to do was enjoy the blessings God had given them, tend the garden, and don't eat from this one tree, right? Follow His directions, and they weren't very smart, and they did the one thing they weren't supposed to do, and it's easy for us to pick on them, but we do the same thing. We take that forbidden fruit, whatever that sin is that we like to take out and play with and put back, we do the same thing that they did, because in a sense we're not all that bright sometimes either. Sure. Before we look at John chapter 10, I want to look at John chapter 9. And the reason being, I think John chapter 10, as Jesus is talking, he's actually referring to events that happen in John chapter 9. In John chapter 9, we are introduced to a blind man. And this man had been born blind, so he had never seen. And that's the story where Jesus goes and spits on the ground and makes clay and anoints the man's eyes, and then tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. And when he did what Christ said, he could see. And that's an important point to note, that he didn't see until he followed through with what Christ told him. But he did that, and the Pharisees got wind of it. And the Pharisees, of course, didn't like Jesus, and were always looking for an opportunity to discredit Jesus. And so the fact that this event happened to occur on the Sabbath, they used that to try to discredit Jesus, who had done this miracle and healed this blind man. And so they they interrogate the blind man, and they ask questions about what all happened and how did it happen and who was this person. And then they go and interrogate his parents. And his parents were afraid of the Pharisees, and so they basically said, well, go ask him. He's old enough, you can ask him. And so they go back and they interrogate the man again. And finally, they're asking him all these questions. And finally, the man says in verse 32, since the world began, it has been unheard that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And so you have this confession of this man who can now see that look, this man who healed me had to be from God. And he's basically preaching to the Pharisees and educating the Pharisees. It's interesting that this man who had been blind could actually see who Jesus was more clearly than the Pharisees, who were supposed to be the religious elite of that day. And the Pharisees, of course, didn't like that response, and so they go and they kick the man out of the synagogue. They excommunicate him from the synagogue, which really shows the character of those people. Jackie? Okay. They answered and said to him, "You were completely born in sins, and are you teaching us?" And they cast him out. Exactly. And that's the attitude they had. Exactly. And so they kick him out. And Jesus comes back in chapter 10, and of course, when this was written, there weren't chapters and verses and things. It would have just flowed a lot better. So if we ignore the chapter break, I think Jesus is actually referring to these Pharisees and some of the things that he talks about. So let's read our text and talk about some of these things, beginning in chapter 10, verse 1. "Most assuredly I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. Yet they will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers." Jesus used this illustration, but they did not understand the things which he spoke to them. Then Jesus said to them again, "Most assuredly I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy. I have come that they may have life, and that they may have it more abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. But a hireling who is not the shepherd, one who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf catches the sheep and scatters them. The hireling flees because he is a hireling and does not care about the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep and am known by my own. As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and lay down my life for the sheep. And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. Therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This command I have received from my Father." Old Testament prophets had prophesied and foretold that false shepherds would come. And some of those discussions about sheep and shepherds, they had told that false prophets, false shepherds would come. And so the story of this blind man and the Pharisees is an example, it seems, of the sheep being the blind man and the people, the robbers, who would break into the sheepfold, or the hireling who's described, who really doesn't care as much about the sheep as the true shepherd. Because the Pharisees, they gave off the appearance of being religious, right? They looked the part. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus, he dressed these guys down because they looked religious, and they wanted men to think they were religious because of the way they prayed, because of the way they dressed, but their actions betrayed them. Our actions will either exonerate us or they'll betray us. Our actions show others either that we are religious, that we are servants of God, or that we're really not. And these Pharisees, by kicking this man out of the synagogue, who all he did was get healed of something that had afflicted him since birth, and admit that it must have been of God that it happened, that's all he did, and yet it was enough for the Pharisees to kick him out. It really showed that the Pharisees didn't have love for other people. The Pharisees were all about them, and rather than be happy for this man, rather than understand that, yeah, that makes sense, it must have come from God, because it might have taken away a little bit of their power and their authority, they kicked the man out. And so Jesus goes into a discussion of, here's how you can tell who the true shepherd is versus who breaks in and steals, okay, or who the hireling is. And Israel would have understood this metaphor because, of course, as we said, the number of sheep that were in that country or in that area at this time. So Jesus draws from their culture to contrast his care for the needy with the self-serving ways of the Pharisees. And I think the discussion of the hireling is very interesting because, somebody that you would hire to take care of the sheep, are they going to care for the sheep in the same way that you would if the sheep belonged to you? And Jesus, of course, points out that they wouldn't. In that day, now I guess if you've got sheep, you're worried about stray dogs. You might have the occasional coyote that comes and messes with the sheep. But in their day, they had critters that were a lot worse. Remember when David came to fight Goliath and was trying to talk Saul into letting him fight Goliath? He said, look, God has delivered me from the paw of the lion and has delivered me from bears. So evidently in this area, they're worried about lions and bears getting the sheep. So that stray dog is the least of their concern. So these shepherds would have had to be tough, rugged individuals to do what they did. And somebody who's just doing it for money, who doesn't really care about the sheep, if they're having to fight a lion to protect the sheep, they're going to leave, okay? They're going to flee. And that's what Jesus is saying. And so the Pharisees, they were like the hired help. As long as everything's good and as long as we're in control and as long as we look okay to the people, that's fine. But when things change, their true colors are going to come out. The fact that they don't really care about the people, they're going to be exposed for who they really are. I really liked I think it was on page 78 of the lesson book, the author said, people indicate whose sheep they are by whose voice they follow. People indicate whose sheep they are by whose voice they follow. In verses 4 and 5, Jesus said, and when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. Yet they will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. When I used to do 4-H work, and I didn't have any experience with sheep because we didn't have sheep. I don't guess we ever wanted sheep. So I didn't know anything about sheep. And so one day, this Scott Chadwell was agent in Putnam County, and he had been working about 30 years, and I just basically started doing 4-H work. And he called and said, Chris, I've got an opportunity for you. Now, when somebody who has worked 3 decades longer than you calls and says they have an opportunity for you, you're about to get messed over, okay? And so this opportunity was, he wanted me to be in charge of our regional sheep show. And I was ignorant, still am in a lot of ways, but I won't do this again. I took him up on it, and so I became in charge of our regional sheep show. And I learned a lot about sheep really quickly. That they annoy me, first of all, because of all the noise they make. But also, what this says is absolutely true. Those kids, if they really work with those lambs will follow them wherever they want to go. And they don't need a halter. If they work with them a lot, they'll just follow them right off the trailer into the show ring, right back into the trailer. We'll follow them right to the slaughterhouse, okay? Literally, if they've worked with them, they know the voice of those kids. And there's research that's been done that shows that even years can go by, and they'll remember a voice. They'll remember the voice of a shepherd. So they may not be as dumb as I thought they were, but this is true, and they'll follow whose they are. And so if we think of ourselves as sheep, we're going to follow somebody. Okay, we're either going to follow Jesus or we're going to follow Satan. And I really just like that statement. People indicate whose sheep they are by whose voice they follow. If we're following the voice of God, people are going to see that. And if we don't, people are going to see that too. And the shepherd knows the sheep. And Jesus points that out, that he knows the sheep, and those kids knew their sheep. You go to a county fair and you see kids, and they'll have 10 halters in their hands with sheep behind those halters and drag them up, and you'll check them in, and those kids can tell you, well, this sheep was born this day, this sheep was born this day. Here's the mama, here's the daddy, they'll know all the details about these sheep. They know their animals. And Jesus says, I know my sheep. And I think as we reflect on that should bring us comfort. Because our world, has a way of making us not feel important. Sometimes we talk about being too arrogant and feeling too prideful about ourselves. But sometimes we can go the opposite way, and we cannot think nearly as highly as we ought to, because we're made in the image of God, and we're special. We're important. And the world, tells us that, look, if you're a man and you don't look like Brad Pitt, you're not important. Or if you're a woman and you're not a size 0, you don't matter. That's what the world tells us. But Jesus says, I know my sheep. And so, boy, to think that my Savior knows me and cares about me, who cares what the world thinks? And why would I let the world tell me that I'm not important, because Jesus says I am important? Johnny? Sure. Yeah, and like I say, we focus a lot on being too prideful, and of course we don't need to go that way, but we also need to think, hey, I am special. I am important. I do mean something, and I think that's part of what Jesus is trying to get across here. He also, in verses 7 through 13, describes himself. He had talked in the first 6 verses, or the first 5 verses, about being the shepherd, and they said in verse 6 they didn't understand. And so he tries to go a different route and give them a different analogy. And he says, most assuredly I say, I am the door of the sheep. So he's not only the shepherd, but he's also the door. The door would have been very important, because that's where the sheep would come into safety, and that's where they would go out, back out into the pasture to eat and stay alive. And so by saying he was the doorway, he is the way sheep enter into life. That means he's the means to safety for those who follow him. The I am statements, our teacher's book mentioned several I am statements that I thought were good. Again, I mentioned the metaphors earlier. John uses several of these I am statements in his book to describe Jesus. Jesus used them, and they're captured in John. I am the bread of life in chapter 6. I am the light of the world in chapter 8 and chapter 9. Of course, I am the door, and I am the good shepherd in this chapter. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life in chapter 14. And then I am the true vine in chapter 15. He says, if Jesus set forth participation in the kingdom of heaven as foremost in Matthew, in John's gospel, the emphasis is on the oneness between the Christ and his people. So again, as Johnny kind of said, God don't make no junk, and we are, one with Christ. And I think that's part of what he's trying to get across with this discussion and this analogy between us as sheep and him as our shepherd. I looked up some characteristics of good shepherds, and I narrowed them down to 5, and I think they describe Jesus. And really, as we think about it, of course, elders are described as shepherds too. Peter describes our elders who oversee local congregations as being shepherds. And I think these characteristics Certainly they describe Jesus as the Good Shepherd, but they also describe godly elders. Number one, a good shepherd loves his sheep. And Jesus certainly loves his sheep, as he points out that he laid down his life willingly. And he stresses that in these verses, that he willingly, nobody took it from him. He willingly laid down his life for his sheep. A good shepherd understands the needs of the sheep better than they do. A sheep is not smart enough, I guess, to understand what they need all the time. And like I said, they'll go in places they don't need to go, but a good shepherd understands what the sheep needs, and godly elders understand what the flock needs. The difference obviously is that elders are men. They make mistakes, but hopefully they understand the needs of the sheep. A good shepherd understands what threatens the sheep. Jesus foretold or talked about false teachers that would come in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they were what? Ravenous wolves. Okay, they were dangerous. So Jesus understood what threatens sheep. A good shepherd works to provide protection and security. That is I would think, the primary role of a shepherd, but also a very important role that Jesus protects us and provides safety, and godly elders do the same thing. And finally, number 5, searches out sheep when they stray. Jesus talked about, if a man had 100 sheep and 99 of them were here and they were safe, and there was one that had strayed, he'd leave the 99 and go find the one. And elders, as shepherds of the flock, have that same responsibility to go out and search sheep when they stray. And the great shepherd certainly does that for us. Unlike the scribes and Pharisees, Jesus had genuine concern for his followers. Our lesson, our book is about ministry. And people can tell. People can tell if we have the mindset of a Pharisee versus the mindset of a true shepherd that actually cares about people. The Pharisees showed by the way they treated not just this blind man who wasn't blind anymore, but by the way they treated a lot of people. People could tell what was in their hearts, and certainly could tell that it wasn't a good thing. All right, that's 2 bells. I appreciate your attendance this morning and your good comments.